Scott Pendlebury from the Collingwood Football Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
This is Patrick Crouch from the Carlton Footy Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Max Gorn, Melbourne Football Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
We are almost out of the 20s and venturing into the teens. The number 21 most relevant player on my list for 2025, Brisbane Lions defender Keidean Coleman. We were hot on him 12 months ago as a community. ACL stuffed that plan up, but hopefully we can run it back and it work out for us in 2025. We'll see how we go. Joining me on this episode of the 50 Most Relevant as we talk through Kitty, what could be and what might not be for 2025, is a man that is one half of the Fantasy Footy Mailbag. These guys have done some fantastic stuff through podcasting, do some brilliant Supercoach content, and also you've got to follow them on social media. And one of the best looking fantasy footy logo content creators I've seen. That's an absolute rip of the brand new one. I've got Damo from the Footy Mailbag. Hello, mate. How are you?
It's good to be here, MJ, talking about Keidean Coleman, a guy who you could make a strong argument for and against, and it's going to be interesting to see which way fantasy coaches lean when we get to the end of our argument.
It certainly is. If we look back at his 2024 season, it was here for a short time. Unfortunately, one game, didn't complete it, went down in opening round, averaged in the mid-30s across the format. As a result, in Supercoach, he's crazy scary cheap for us. He's down at $269,100 after averaging just the 37 last year. While in Fantasy and Dream Team, still pretty cheap in contrast to what he could be, but nowhere near as cheap. He's just a touch over $500,000 in Fantasy and a little bit under that in Dream Team. That's due to an average of 34. And when I say average, he just had the one game. So that's the top scores we're looking at. Really, though, what has coaches looking to his potential, as we all still remember that grand final, don't we, at the end of 2023. Absolutely dominant at halftime, was leading the Norm Smith medal. We thought we had a breakout in 2024, but as Damo's mentioned, we might get even more upside now in 2025. We were really robbed as a fantasy community, and Brisbane ultimately, it didn't disrupt the team too much. They ultimately go and win the flag the year later, Damo. But his ability to find opponents in incredible traffic with that lethal boot of his run and carry, and how he finds himself just in the right position, his scoring through transition, his ability to read and then ultimately set up the play. Like, we'll talk about this 2023 and trends in a moment, but from a genuine footballing sense, he's such an exciting player to watch when he is fit and firing in the ground.
Yeah, absolutely. And he's the kind of guy that prefers to dispose of the ball by foot as well. So that means you're going to get maximum points for every disposal he gets. And we spoke about that opening round game. Even though he only scored 37 in Supercoach, 34 in AFL Fantasy, that was in 44% time on ground off just 8 disposals. So he was not that far off from getting to that 40, 45 at halftime mark. And that was off under 10 disposals, meaning, he was hitting his targets. There was those long, accurate kicks. It was just because of the way he disposes of the ball, we were able to get the maximum output, even though we only saw him for a short time last season.
Yeah, it's true. So much of us is going back to look, because we don't have any 2024 data outside of that very small sample size. We go back to 2023 to remind ourselves of why, as a community, we were so interested, intrigued about him and his scoring potential over those final few months of the year. Like, we're talking about a guy who, just in the final 10 games of 2023, if you include the finals that are excluded from adjusting your fantasy and Supercoach price points and averages, we're talking about a guy who's basically a mid-90s average guy across the formats, like 93, 94 sort of territories. There's multiple tons through there, including that monster that we alluded to in the grand final. So much to like about that. We come into 2024 with expectation, and injury hits. And while ACLs are never great, I think what gives us a little bit of confidence here, Damo, while we talk about the team and the structure in a moment, is we have, at least pretty recently, seen Brisbane show they know how to manage players coming off ACLs pretty well.
Yeah, we don't need to look far to see Will Ashcroft return from his ACL, get going in that final part of the season, and then win the Norm Smith medal. He came off his ACL and he was basically straight into the fitness program, straight into the football program, straight from recovery, straight from his 12 months off. And we saw him build into the season, and he became one of the best players in both formats towards the back end of that season. So we should have confidence that whatever program Brisbane have put Keidean Coleman through, they've got the experience to know that it works. And if we pick him, we should have confidence that he's going to score well, or at least not miss a beat from where he was, 12, 18 months ago.
There's like 3 or 4 things I got to ask you. I'm super curious on your take in terms of opening round, getting that early look, where he's at in his recovery and training stages through preseason. But the team is very different to the one he left injured to what he's now coming back into. One of the ultimate success stories of Brisbane last year was the deployment of former captain Dane Zorko into that halfback spot that was reserved for Keidean Coleman. And Zorko thrived. He became an absolute must-have, it felt like, in fantasy footy last year, and had potentially his career high in so many different areas, let alone the premiership. How do you see this backline functioning again? Because back in 2023, when Kitty really got going, Daniel Rich wasn't a factor. It was McKenna. It was Wilmot. He really grew into that space where now I don't see any good reason for Brisbane to move Zorko out of this position. His market share, the ease of all the ball funneling through him might not be as easy a narrative to get to as we thought it was 12 months ago. What do you see as the impact of Zorko staying in that halfback space? And can there be a pathway that this seriously hurts Coleman?
Dane Zorko in that role, he did really well. And as you say, it kind of revived his career, and there's no reason why he needs to move out from something that works. Don't fix it if it ain't broke. But he didn't have a partner. He didn't have someone on the opposite wing, didn't have someone else distributing when he was shut down, because eventually teams went to Dane Zorko and there wasn't another player that was kind of the designated next in line. They had Darcy Wilmot, Connor McKenna, even Brandon Starcevich had his moments, but they didn't have that next guy. And you look at all the good teams and they've all got that next guy who can step up into that role if they want them to. So I think Keidean Coleman might not be the main guy, but he might eventually evolve into that, with Dane Zorko eventually becoming that extra. But I think together they can work as long as they work on opposite sides of the ground.
And I think the beauty is he's priced even lower than where he was 12 months ago for us. There is that returning from ACL that I do want to talk further with you in a moment, but he's priced now at even such a greater value space than he was 12 months ago. The threshold for what he needs to score to generate the kind of funds we want, to be able to turn him as an upgrade option through that kind of middle to latter portion of the mid-season buys, if not before that, if we require. It's not as high as the threshold where it was like, man, if he doesn't go 85 plus, 90 plus, this selection's a burn. Well, now, based on where he's priced at, like he's coming off that average of low 30s in Supercoach. It is not too far off Sam Lawler cash territory. So he's an inflated rookie at that price point. If he can get you that 70 range, which a fit Coleman in that spot, I think is very conservative to project, especially when you think about what he did over those final 10 weeks of 2023. I think in Supercoach, you can have confidence that while a 90 might be a stretch, a 70 is just in the pathway of what's acceptable for us. While it might need to be a little bit higher for us to really crank the value in fantasy and in Dream Team, he's still priced at a spacing for us where he doesn't have to be Mr. 85, Mr. 90, Mr. 95 to really work for us the way that we think. And we talked a moment ago, Damo, about Brisbane's good history of managing players off ACL. Clearly, they've got an incredible medical team. When you get Joe Danaher, who was just always injured at Essendon, you get him and Lincoln McCarthy both basically reviving their careers from injuries. They're clearly doing something right up there. But every time people go out and watch Brisbane train, every time there's press conferences and people talking with players, it seems to be an increasing narrative that he's not yet in full training. We are still at we're at the arse end of January, not quite February as this episode has landed, but we're not that far away from preseason matches, intra-clubs, internal trials, and ultimately their season starts earlier, being on opening round. It's sounding more and more increasingly like we might not have Keidean Coleman, not even just for opening round, but potentially even round one.
Yeah, it's a worry when the club comes out and says they're confident that he's on track to recover, that he'll be back in the early part of the season, but they're not committing to a round 0 or a round 1, return. And people are starting him or wanting to start him in their teams, and there's good reason to want to have that. But if he's not going to be there in round 0, round 1, then he might actually turn out to just be maybe a downgrade option or a sideways option from a rookie that isn't making enough cash fast enough. So there's other ways to get him in. You don't have to start him, but you want to at least have seen him out there for a good portion of the preseason before he lines up, because you want to be sure that there's that fitness base and he's not going to be, a slave to that sub rule.
Yeah, and there's a world where that could be the case, isn't it? We've seen multiple teams use the substitute position, either with the red or the green, to just manage players in and through at the elite level rather than putting them through the twos to get a run of games through there. I'd personally prefer it because he's at an interesting juncture in this space, because not only while we think it will be a minimal impact of Zorko, we'd like to see what that truly is, and that's where the opening round benefit could still be, while increasingly less likely in my view. We wanted to see the role, how it splits, how it works. We want to see that. Let alone the fact that in this price point, you're basically going down to a rookie from there. There's not much else in this range that sits there for us. So it becomes almost an ideal outcome for us that he doesn't play in opening round, because Brisbane, by playing on that, will miss a few weeks later in round 3. So from a super coach perspective, with the 3-week price cycle, it's almost ideal to go, I'd love to have a look at round 1. I'd love to have a look at round 2. Take a week off, get yourself right, get fresh, and then let's go from round 4. I know it feels weird to say it, but to me, that almost feels like the preferred outcome now for me, so that I have way more confidence about what Keidean Coleman could deliver.
Yeah, absolutely. But it could also go the other way, where he's the sub in the first 2 weeks. Brisbane have that bye, and then you kind of have to make a decision whether you liked what you saw from that minimum of game time that he got, and if you want to jump on. And then after that, the price is on its way, or maybe the price goes down. Maybe he hasn't scored well enough for that to happen. And it's a difficult situation if he doesn't line up, and if we don't see him, and if that sub rule does affect his game at all, because it almost puts him, out of calculations for a lot of people. But some other people, some shrewd coaches might see that as a positive and decide to pick him up, knowing that he's going to get a full game eventually, and, you can loop him off your bench.
Yeah, it's a really good reflection. I think one of the reasons so much of us wants to pick Coleman isn't just the history of what he did over the final few months of 2023, but from a structure and a balance perspective, it would just feel so much easier to pick him, because there are some really good rookie options in our backline. They'll become more known through February, but it feels like right now there's some really good scoring and well-placed role options in our backline. If we don't want to spend too much at the top of the tree of the defensive line and are looking for a bit of value in every position, Coleman feels like he manages that spot beautifully, of low price point, high value upside. But the challenging thing is, if he's not there round 0, not there round 1, you're stuck. So to me, I'd be encouraging coaches, build your structure expecting him not to be there. All the news keeps coming out from track watchers and media and players. Just that doubt that he's going to be right. if he's not even in full training just yet, there is no point for Brisbane pushing it in March. This is a premiership contending team. They are wanting to go back to back. There is no benefit slugging Coleman to have to get him to the fantasy footy internal deadline, which is opening round 1. Whereas for them, they're like, man, if it's round 4, round 5, round 6, we just want this really clean, smart ball user at the right time of the year. And if we need to go slow, we want to manage it right. So to me, I wouldn't be building a team structure with Coleman in it at all. I'd rather be pleasantly surprised in the final days before lockout. He's there, he looks good, the role is right, and then make the decision, not do it now, get stuck. Round 1 teams are there and you're like, he's not named. Oh no, Damo, what do I do? Because no one makes good decisions on that Thursday night. Was the Richmond-Carlton game, and you start tinkering with your fantasy side. I don't know one coach that said, I made some tinkers there and it changed everything for the better. That is how we destroy our team and months of work.
This episode is brought to you by Allstate. Some people just know they could save hundreds on car insurance by checking Allstate first. Like you know to check the date of the big game first before you accidentally buy tickets on your 20th wedding anniversary and have to spend the next 20 years of your marriage making up for it. Yeah, checking first is smart. So check Allstate first for a quote that could save you hundreds. You're in good hands with Allstate. Savings vary. Terms apply. Allstate Fire and Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Northbrook, Illinois.
Yeah, I think people will say that they have a backup plan, but I think Keidean Coleman should be your backup plan. You shouldn't start him and then pivot. You should start without him and then pivot if he's named and looks good. So, yeah, you don't want to be caught, in limbo when he doesn't line up, and then you have to restructure your back line, or you have to restructure your midfield to fit him into your back line, or something along those lines. You don't want to be stuck by, completely ruining your team just to fit this one guy in that's might not even be a keeper for the whole season.
Yeah, it's a really good shout. There's one last question I want to ask you before we go, but there is a growing injury history with Coleman. Now, the ACL is pretty significant, and he's had no other significant major injury like that to his knee, but there's 4 or 5 other games since the start of 2023 where he's getting in-game injury impacted. So is that a reason not to pick him? Well, no, I think the combination of high ownership percentage, incredible value of price versus proven output, not projected hoped output. These kind of things sort of protect that injury history. But it did, again, it felt like, barring a freak ACL, he'd got over most of those. So let's give him a little bit of grace on the injury side. And again, I'm always a believer of, embed that injury profile into your starting squad rather than that. The last thing I want to ask you before we do talk about drafts and look at what you and the team at Footy Mailbag have got coming for us in the preseason is, are we forcing or reaching for Kitty Coleman here? Like 10 games of data, I know it's quite a lot. I'm quite bullish on a James Peatling, who's really only got 10 games of good data. And so we build this narrative of why and how we should build a player into our structure. But I don't know, what's your take? Are the community forcing something about Keidean that's not there? Or is it actually truly there? The scoring, the output, the function, the role, the capacity, and the injuries just has been a setback and now a blessing in price point. What's your take? Is this a forced move, or are we just adapting to what's been given to us accurately?
I think last year you could mount that it was maybe a reach. He was 130k more in Supercoach, 100k more in fantasy, and maybe then it was a bit of a reach, but now he's closer to rookie price. I think you can afford to be wrong because he doesn't have to average a lot, as you mentioned earlier, that to make money or to be a successful selection. So maybe we were reaching 12 months ago, but because his price has dropped so significantly in both formats, I don't think it's as much of a reach now as it was 12 months ago. But we're looking for roles. We're looking for things that worked for teams in the back end of the season. And Brisbane just missed out on the grand final, winning the grand final the year before. So they were going to change something. And Keidean Coleman was such a good player in that grand final. They were sure to, stick him right back there and go, hey, that worked. We should continue that because it actually gave us a chance to win in the grand final in the biggest day of the AFL calendar. So why remove him from that place again? And now we get him this season. He's 130k cheaper than what he was like 12 months beforehand. Only needs to average 70, 75 to make 100, 150k. I don't think we're reaching this year, but maybe last year we were.
Yeah, that's a really good reflection. So what do you believe is the best case scenario, friend, around Keidean Coleman? Is it you want to hope that you get that free look in opening round? He plays through there. You get to see what he will be and also know what that score and ultimate starting price movement could become across the formats? Or do you want to wait for him to just appear in season and have to use a trade just to bring him in along the way? I think regardless of whenever we do see Coleman play in 2025, as a fantasy football community, we will be watching carefully because in this price range, there's not a lot of options. And if he can deliver even towards the basement end of what his end of 2023 gave us, this is going to be a selection that will be hard to ignore. But as I said, I would be building with the expectation he's not there. And as Damo's put so beautifully, make him the backup to your plans, not have a backup to him as the plan. But on draft day, all of those averages, all of the price point goes out the window. It's all about projecting. What are they going to do in 2025? For people that draft based purely off seasonal averages, they will forget Coleman existed because no one's scrolling down to the mid-30s to find somebody. But we do know the salary cap community hype does impact drafters, maybe more so because they're salary cap players playing draft than the draft community being bulldozed through by classic players. Where do you think he goes? If it was 5 defenders on field, which of those? He's certainly not going to be anyone's D1, D2, probably not even their D3. Are you happy with him as an on-field defender from your perspective, Damo, or would you rather stash him away as a bench option?
I mean, ideally for Keidean Coleman, when you're drafting him, you'd want him D4, D5, or your first bench option, and that probably sits him in the lower middle order, depending on how you're building your team when you're drafting. I know some people that go midfield heavy early, some people that go forward heavy early, but when it comes to selecting Keidean Coleman, you don't want him any higher than your D4 position, and you probably even want him lower than that so you have some flexibility with your lineup as well.
Yeah, probably the timing of when you do your draft might determine just how late he goes. If this story of him not being right for opening round continues to gain truth and momentum, well, all of a sudden, you probably don't have to reach that extra round 2 or 3 that you might have to secure his services as people fade their interest and hope to pick him up late. So my preferred spot would be the bench, but in a couple of leagues, I'll probably miss him in that spot, while in some other leagues, I might just get lucky and pick him through there. I still think he's a great scorer. I think Zorko will actually help ease him into the season. Maybe not ease in terms of scoring, but ease in terms of responsibility. And I think you've pointed out beautifully for us, Damo, a couple of key things to consider about him, both in our draft sides and our classic teams. Mate, where can people get in touch with yourself? Footy Mailbag's been around now for a couple of seasons, always pumping out great content across social media and through the podcast. If we've never heard of you because we've come from the AFL Fantasy community going, oh, I like how he talks about footy, I want to tune in, or we just don't have that large diet of super coach content creators yet and want to catch up with you and the guys more, where can we get in touch and hear what you do this preseason?
So you'll find everything on our website, thefootymailbag.net. That's got all the links to our social medias. It's got every podcast on the front page, all linked at the top there. We've also got some written content as well that we've been pumping out this preseason. Every team analysed with their locks, breakouts, players you don't really want to go near, some boom bust calls, all that sort of thing. So just go to thefootymailbag.net and you'll find everything you need from us.
It's Footy Mailbag. Link is in our bio of this episode too, so you can just click on the description, go in there, check it out. So if you just want to grab the hyperlink and just go straight there, we've got you sorted for that. Hey mate, always a pleasure to talk Supercoach with you. I'm sure we'll be in touch throughout the 2025 season proper. If you've been enjoying this series of the 50 most relevant, as we talk through the players that I've listed as my most important and relevant players, go back and check out the list if you haven't already done so. There are some interesting moves and some names that are still to come. If you're watching this on YouTube, comment below. What do you think he's going to average for us in 2025? If you're listening to the audio podcast and you haven't subscribed or given it a 5-star rating, make sure you do so. And inside the description of this episode isn't just the place to get in touch with Damo and the guys from the Footy Mailbag, but it's also got all our social media links, how you can get your hands on some Coaches Panel merch and also become part of our Patreon, who get a bunch of great rewards and support the Coaches Panel year round. Would you like a clue about who is the last in the 20s? I'll make it real simple for you. Well, maybe not by name, but by conversation. What we do at F1 feels pretty structurally important this year. I feel like there's 2 or 3 really important structural decisions that we have to make this preseason. And what we do at F1, while may not be the most important, does have a cascading impact on a lot of other selections. So tomorrow, we're putting a potential F1 candidate into the 50 most relevant. Some would say there's not enough value. Some would say, I'm not certain about the role. And some would say, I don't even know if he'll play the whole season. Who are we talking about? Who's this potential F1 that we think, if you haven't already considered, you're missing a trick? Find out tomorrow in the 50 most relevant.